All right, welcome back. This lecture is on breaking the rules. Breaking the rules. Now, all art has rules of interactivity. And I am, again, lumping in game into art uh, because it is. So, all art has rules of interactivity. You might know from sort of traditional art that, for example, you cannot touch sculptures. You cannot walk up to a painting and touch paintings. There are rules of interactivity. You cannot during the theater during a theater performance. You can't stand up and start shouting. That's breaking the rules of interaction with that piece of art. And again, all art has these rules to various degrees. However, knowing these rules allows you to effectively break those rules. Um, and this is true of any particular art form. Like the better you know the rules of that given art form, the better you can break them. If you don't know the rules and you start breaking those rules, then it feels hollow. It feels like you're not playing correctly, as it were. Pablo Picasso once said, "You learn the rules like a pro, so you can break them like an artist." Now, I'm not sure he did actually say that, and I can't quite find it, but it's a pretty cool quote regardless. So, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at some prior examples of fine art and how people have broken the rules. Um, some classic examples. This is a sculpture by Marcel Duchamp called Fountain from 1917. And this is kind of the start of modern art in a lot of ways. He was a painter, and he basically just found a urinal and submitted the urinal to an open exhibition, probably the top exhibition in the world, uh, as a piece of art at a point in time in which that had never happened before. He actually was on the selection board of that same exhibit. Um, and when the rest of the selection board said that he couldn't, it wasn't acceptable, he actually quit. It was shown in the exhibit, but it was shown behind a screen that you had to kind of find. But it did kick off the sort of modern art movement of found objects, and the switch from an aesthetic interpretation of art to an intellectual interpretation of art, which was a shift that defines a lot of modernism and postmodernism. So earlier than that, a dude named Edouard Manet, who was painting in the late 19th century, submitted this painting called Olympia to another salon exhibit, which again caused a whole lot of furor. Now, there's a historical precedent, and this is what I mean in terms of like once you know the rules, you can play with the rules. There's a historical precedent for this painting. There's a long history of sort of nudie women in fine art that's vaguely titillating, yet couched in mythology. So this would be Venus, for example, and a lot of the times it is Venus, and it's kind of a not necessarily cheap, but thinly veiled excuse um, to have somewhat titillating work up on the wall. Now, this is another example by Alexandre Canabel, Birth of Venus, and this was painted in the exact same year that Manet was doing his work as well. And the differences between this and this are quite striking. Like the Canabel is very much in the old school tradition, and fancy floral stuff floating around, and the main figure of Venus is there as a subject to the gaze, and we'll talk about the gaze again in the subject on the in the lecture on Who Am I in gameplay. We'll look at the gazes there as well. Whereas Manet's interpretation was incredibly confrontational. The subject is looking directly at you. The main issue that people had at the time with this particular painting was that she just looked like a normal person. She looked like someone you would meet at the street. There was further stuff, and the people found that offensive. Like you can't raise someone on the street to the level of a Venus, of a goddess. It was seen as vulgar. And there's some other stuff going on in terms of the the representation of the maid and the flowers and the cat over on the right hand side, that further sort of played around with social dynamics at the time and the idea of what painting was. Going further back, there was a Spanish painter named Velázquez who painted this painting called Las Meninas, which is ostensibly about the king and queen Philip IV of Spain. And again, there's a historical precedent for this kind of painting. So this is Philip IV of Spain in a very, very different style. Like, he is up front, it is meticulously painted, it is very much about him. Whereas Las Meninas, I'm not sure if you can quite pick it out, but Philip IV is right there. That's him. And he is tiny and quite irrelevant in the painting. However, this painting is seen as this like a seminal moment in the history of art, because of the way that it used those conventions, it used those rules and started playing around with them. It put the painter, who is the dude over on the left-hand side with the paintbrush, front and center. Not necessarily front and center, but he is in the painting itself. The courtly people around the king and queen are shown with more importance than the king and queen themselves. The jesters, the fools, the ladies in waiting, they are shown with far more importance than the king and queen itself. And then the character in the door, who is this, quite a high point of contrast back there. There's some debate about who he is as well, but he obviously has some importance as well. But again, it's this idea of knowing the rules allow you to break those rules in really, really constructive and interesting ways. Going back to modern art, we've got this piece by Robert Rauschenberg. And at the time, he was a younger artist. He was fairly well established. But there was another painter called de Kooning, who at the time was kind of the king of abstract expressionism, and he painted stuff like this. And he was very much in vogue and a very, very important painter at the time. And what Rauschenberg did was he purchased a drawing by de Kooning and then proceeded to erase it. So he took it and just got rid of the artwork itself and submitted just the ground that the artwork was on. And again, this is playing around with the idea of an artist as a creator. And in this example, Robert Rauschenberg, he's creating something out of the process of destruction. And again, those rules, you can play around with them. So what about in games? There's a ton of different examples about how game developers, once they know the rules of games, can start to play around with them. And again, the having the player know those rules is also really, really important. So both the designer and the artist need to know the rules in order to recognize those points at which the designer starts to tweak with those rules. So there are physical ways that a game designer might play around with rules. And the classic example I like is Metal Gear Solid in the Psycho Mantis boss fight. And the Psycho Mantis is kind of this character who is kind of crazy but super glitchy and interesting. And the character seems to know quite a lot about you. And this is back in the day of PlayStation 1, in which you had these cartridges that were your save games, and it would save a bunch of different games on the same cartridge. Now, this particular game would delve into those save games, and it would know what games you had played. And it would know... it would kind of speak back to you as to what games, the other PlayStation games you had played. So it had an awareness of the fact that there was this non-diegetic world that existed outside of the game itself, and was able to leverage it. Not only that, the only way you can actually beat Psycho Mantis was to pull your game controller out of the physical game controller out of the slot that it fits in on your PlayStation, and push it into the player 2 one in order to actually beat Psycho Mantis. So again, it had an awareness of the fact that it was operating within this non-diegetic physical world outside of the game. And this is one of the first times that a game did that it sort of acknowledged the medium itself that it was working with, that the medium and the technology that it was working with. And this idea of stepping away, of breaking the fourth wall, is called metalepsis or metalepsis. So we'll be talking a little bit about that more as the semester goes on, metalepsis. other examples of this happening. There was a Genesis game called X-Men, in which you had to press the reset button in order to beat one of the boss characters, and it gave no hint whatsoever. There was no other point in this game that asked you to break that fourth wall. And it was a really, really frustrating game for a lot of people because no one would ever think that you had to physically press the reset button. And you couldn't press it too long because then it would actually reset the entire game. You just had to press it very quickly, and that would in-game reset the evil computer happening at the time. In Nier Automata, there's a point towards the end of the game in which it kind of trades with you. It proposes a trade in which it deletes all of your save data in order to progress to a certain end state. So it's asking you to give up, to relinquish all of the work that you had put into this game so far in order to get to an end state. There are gamic ways in which you can kind of play around with the rules of game itself. If you've never played the Stanley Parable, please play the Stanley Parable. It is a really, really fantastic game. It doesn't take very long to play. Try to find all of the different endings. Think completely outside of the box for this game. I don't want to give you any spoilers or anything, but it's a really, really exceptional game. I would love to buy it for the school so anyone can play it. But please, if you have a chance to play the Stanley Parable, please play the Stanley Parable. And he's got another game that's also really good. I think it's called The Beginner's something. Can't remember it. Take a look. Other games that kind of also play around with the idea of the genre of games. Doki Doki Literature Club plays around with the idea of sort of Japanese dating sims. Pony Island plays the idea of sort of side-scrolling kids games. Both of those games are relatively cheap, if not free, and are worthwhile just to see how a game designer can play around with the expectations of genre and gameplay. There can be moral ways, and the Nier Automata kind of fits in this as well. There are ways that a game designer can play around with the moral fourth wall. So an example might be Spec Ops: The Line, in which as you play the game, you become increasingly aware, and this is a first-person shooter game in which you're in a battlefield situation and you're killing people. But as the game progresses, you become more and more aware of the moral responsibility and the sort of the problematic nature of playing a game in which you are expected to kill basically everything you see. Undertale is another one of those games that if you've never played Undertale, please go play Undertale. But it's a game in which it kind of it's a roguelike, and it remembers things about the previous ways you've played the game, and it plays around with the moral aspects of fighting everything. And eventually, as you play the game, you realize that fighting is not necessarily the best, most effective way to progress within the game itself. Now, there are a ton of other games that play around with the rules of what games are, and you can't see me, but I'm giving you like the air quotes when I say rules. So the expectations both of genre but also of gameplay and technology. There are a ton of other examples, and you probably have some of your own that you remember and that you really enjoy. Please jump on to the Discord channel or to the stream site and have a conversation about some of those games. Tell other people about really, really cool experiences that you've had so they can go out and find those games and give them a go to. Okay, that's all I got for today. I think I'm under 15 minutes again. Perfect. Take care, and we'll see you later.